Hello everyone and welcome back to my videos. This is part 2 of the Through It All series by Orion_Writes. We'll be reading where we left off, starting with chapter 4. With that out of the way, let's get on with the video. Chapter 4. Breathe, breathe, breathe. I tried to calm my nerves, my palms sweaty with anticipation. By the time our planning had been completed, my bruises from that night had nearly healed. Of course, new ones replaced them quickly, but that was the price of a roof over your head in this city. All my expectations of L'Manberg were shattered. Everything was a lie. There was no way to seek my fortune. No. There were only 3 factions: the rich, the criminal, and the poor. Right now, I was on the fine line between the last two. This is a city corrupted with unruly people, and as his world crumbles under the weight of its own futility, Dream sits on the throne doing nothing. In the past few weeks, I'd come to sympathize with the revolutionaries. Maybe there was something to their words. Having had my head cleared of fantasies of living a good future dulled me to reality, and I began to see the sense in their reasoning. How dare he sit by, not even showing the world his face, as his people are murdered and stolen from each night right under his nose? Maybe that's what pushed me over the edge and finally convinced me to go through with the heist, robbing the palace, a bit of revenge. I didn't like the smirk on Skeppy's face as he and the blade slid off through the smashed window. It was almost like they knew something I didn't. I paced relentlessly, happy to just be on lookout rather than doing the actual stealing. I shook my hands out by my sides, trying to calm down my stress for the job. Eventually I got curious, sheathing my iron sword and dropping from the tiled roof into the courtyard below. The others would likely have my head for doing so, but I needed to do something or I'd die of boredom. I glanced through the nearest window, heart pounding. A little bit of movement to keep me going and invested wouldn't hurt, right? I squinted through the frosted glass. The room behind it seemed to be a sort of office, with a handsome acacia desk and stacks of books lining the walls. What caught my eye was a glint from the desk, a flash of purple against the dull background. I pressed myself up against the window, staring in further. I could make out the shape of a small circle, emblazoned with purple in the middle. What was it? I looked around hastily, temptation luring me to the mysterious object. The area was deserted. I'm about to break into Dream's palace. What is wrong with me? I tried to turn and walk away, but there was something magnetic about it. I had to have it. I rotated my neck in indecision, scratching my head. Fuck it. I jabbed my elbow into the glass, flinching at the high and clear sound of the window shattering. At first I swore I heard movement, and ducked behind a ledge, trying to steady myself on behind the quartz pillar I'd hidden behind. After deciding there was nothing there, I slowly revealed myself and climbed cautiously through the window. I dropped soundlessly onto the striped birch flooring, scanning the area. I scuttled over to the desk, trying to keep myself grounded in reality, and not have my mind overtaken by the overwhelming quantity of adrenaline pumping through my blood. The object that had caught my undivided attention. I picked it up in my pale, slender fingers by the edges, terrified to break it, despite not knowing what it was and not knowing how breakable it was. The object was circular and composed of material I couldn't begin to describe. Dips ran along the edges, giving it a rigid texture beneath my raw and blistered fingertips. It felt wrong for me to touch. The captivating nature of the disc-shaped item contrasted with my rough appearance, and lack of self-care made my chest tighten. My brain was screaming at me to drop it and leave, but I just couldn't. I looked at the purple center, which is what had first caught my eye. It was a label, denoting something. I read it over and over, and the words still didn't make sense. Was it in another language? I had no clue. Mellowhigh. What a funny word. Mellowhigh, I whispered, trying the sound in my mouth. I frowned. It was curious, the way it rolled off my tongue and tasted like sweetened honey. It was a disconcerting taste, like when you know you should stop eating something sugary, but you can't stop yourself. It's addicting. I swore suddenly, clapping a hand over my mouth as a loud crash resonated from outside. I didn't know what forced me, but I hastily stuffed the object in my cloak, going to investigate. I vaulted out the window, hissing in pain as I braced myself on the scale, the broken glass digging into my palm. I gritted my teeth, removing the clear material from my hands and shaking them slightly to distract myself. I bit back a cry of pain as I used my bleeding hands to climb back up from the courtyard. Fumbling for my sword, I ducked behind the ledge I'd been camped by earlier, awaiting other sounds. "Tommy!" My head whipped up at the sound of Skeppy's weaselly voice, and I peeked over the curve of the tile, spying his sandy hair. The blade was beside him. He seemed to be holding his side, as though in pain. Each of the men held sacks brimming with what I could only assume was gold. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. My eyes widened as they approached. The blade's waist was bleeding heavily where he held it. I did a double take, thinking he'd changed, not realizing he was still wearing his white shirt, only it was now stained crimson with blood. What I'd assumed were shadows around the other man's eye was actually a purple bruise. They looked bad, but I felt no remorse. Now they knew the pain they inflicted upon me. "Well, boy, did you take care of the guards?" I swallowed. I hadn't actually seen any guards. Not that there were ones to be found in our current position. We were on the roof. The soldiers patrolled the bottom floor. I coughed dryly, nodding my head. Yep, all done." I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Skeppy nodded his approval, smirking. "Let's get out of here before those bastards that beat us up raise the alarm," the pig mask-wearing man urged. I quirked an eyebrow. They'd been seen. Excellent. Time for an escape. This was not what I had bloody signed up for, although admittedly it was either this or dying of starvation on the streets, so not much of a choice. I sheathed my sword, mumbling to myself. "What was that?" Skeppy asked sharply. Nothing," I replied sheepishly, trying to hide my discomfort as we skirted the roof. Pressed up against the walls of the tower that poked through the skyline, I followed the two across the length of the castle. We came to the chink in the wall that we'd entered by, and found a problem. Guards, and lots of them. We couldn't exit any other way, as this was where we'd burrowed in. We were trapped. I looked over at Skeppy and the blade to convey my concern, only to find them grinning, malice painting their faces. I saw the bigger man's eyes flash darkly from behind his mask. I didn't like the looks on their faces. "Well, Tommy, this is it. You've served us well," Skeppy started. I blinked rapidly, confused. "You have, I thinks." For what?" I backed away as they advanced, unaware that I was getting closer to the edge. "Well, Tommy, I thought you were smart. You were clearly never of any real value to us. You will now serve your final purpose, the distraction." The blade's words only just clicked, the missing pieces into place. I opened my mouth to scream, but it was too late. With a wicked smirk, the masked man pushed me off the roof, chuckling quietly. I lay powerless to defend myself as the guards began to call out, pointing below to my unresponsive body. I heard one last phrase issuing from the blade's mouth before he left. "Blood for the blood god." Chapter 5. One thought was clear in my head. Stash Melahai. I didn't know where the idea occurred from, but in the heat of the moment as the palace guards descended, it made sense. I searched desperately, finding no suitable spots. I felt the grass beneath me and squeezed my eyes shut. I'd have to dig. With my blistered, bleeding, raw hands, this would be painful. I fought back a yelp of pain as I tore up the earth below me, wincing with every scoop of dirt, the soil stinging my cut palms. I barely got it covered in time as the soldiers appeared, shouting scrutinies that I didn't hear for my pounding ears. I'd had the air knocked from me as I fell, and everything ached. In my haste to hide the mysterious object, I hadn't bothered to check on my physicality, and I slowly raised my hand to the back of my head, already feeling a lumpy bruise forming. I tested the injury, pressing on it gently. Black spots swam through my vision, and for a second I thought I was about to pass out. In my state as slightly disconnected from reality, I failed to see the ground ripped away from me as I was forced onto my knees, until I could no longer feel the tendrils of grass tickling my cheek. I couldn't really make out the face of the man in front of me as my vision was still fuzzy from the fall. I caught a white tunic worn over a black undershirt, and the hair the color of opals, held back by a strip of white cloth. He grabbed a fistful of my hair, bringing his face up close to mine. "What have we got, Sap?" The voice wasn't from the man in front of me, so I assumed it was one of the other guards talking. "It's a kid! It's a fucking kid!" His voice was deep and gravelly, and incredibly unsettling. "A kid broke into the palace? I don't know, okay? I just know he's here, in front of us, looking guilty as sin." I closed my eyes as he hissed, practically in front of my face. "What do we do with him?" "You're head of the King's Guard. It's your call." The black-haired man, Sap, seemed to deliberate for a minute, flickers of several emotions I couldn't identify in my half-conscious state flashing over his face. "Even if he wasn't the one who robbed us, he's trespassing. Throw him in the cells." Ah, that didn't sound great. I couldn't exactly fight back as I was forced to my feet and dragged across the grass in the darkness. All I could do was try and blink the spots out of my eyes. A loud creak of rusted metal indicated we had reached our destination. I was vaguely aware of being flung to the floor, my head once again slamming against the ground. I touched it gently as the door closed, my fingers coming back red and damp. I groaned in pain, shifting myself into a corner, trying to ignore the uncomfortable sensation of the dank ground. A few bales of straw were littered around, and I tried to pull myself over to one so I might rest in more comfort. I gave up soon enough, discovering my arms simply wouldn't obey me. Brilliant. I've really fucked up here. I fought the urge to laugh at my predicament. Oh goodness, I'm trapped in a cell and I want to laugh. Either I'm a psychopath or my head injury is getting to me. I had no idea how long I lay curled into the dark corner. I was still partly out of it, aware only of the constant dripping of the damp walls and the resolute throbbing in my head. I choked back a sob, salty tears mixing in with the blood running freely down my face. "Get your fucking hands off me, you The words were cut off with the sound of skin on skin and a yell of shock. I blinked at the sudden noise. I must have fallen asleep in my corner as the yelling jerked me awake, and suddenly my head didn't hurt as bad. Don't get me wrong, the pounding was still unbearable, but at least I could raise my head. I rubbed my eyes weakly, squinting in the dim light. Coming towards me was a pair of guards, holding between them a tall man who was struggling and barking out vicious insults in their direction. "I said get your hands off me, or I swear I'll snap your fucking necks." My eyes widened as the guard stamped on his foot to try and quell his attempt at fighting back. A third soldier opened the rusty door to my cell and flung him in. The man was smashed against the far wall, but he was immediately up again, running to the bars and rattling them manically, keeping his shouting at a deafening volume. This continued for a few minutes, and I lay in shock, not knowing how to intervene. Eventually he stopped, sighing in defeat and readjusting his black beanie. He wheeled around, finally spotting me. "Oh, a roommate! How nice for me!" He rolled his eyes, regarding me with a bored rigor. I couldn't see his face, but something about his voice was familiar. "What's going on?" I coughed quietly. "These fucking pricks are now deciding that I'm not allowed to express my opinion on our sweet ruler, King Dream." "Oh, a revolutionary." He looked at me, face still shrouded in shadow. "You're bleeding," he observed. "No shit," I chuckled. "That's going to get infected if you're not careful. Come here, let me clean it." I didn't move, looking at him warily. "What?" "Look, Blondie, I don't bite, so unless you want sepsis, I suggest you let me help you." What did I have to lose? I slowly crawled over to him, wincing all the way. I reached his side of the room and noticed him filling a bucket with water from a tap I hadn't noticed. I saw him for the first time and realized where I recognized the man from. It was the same revolutionary I'd seen being attacked by the mob as I entered the city. He crouched next to me, tearing a strip of blue fabric off his sleeve to act as a cloth. "Lie down." He gestured to his lap. Usually I would have found this rather inordinary and mildly uncomfortable, but I was in too much pain to care. I let slip a slight cry as the water made contact with my bleeding head, causing it to sting slightly. "I recognize you. I saw the mob beating you up on the day I got here," I confessed. "I assumed you laughed along with everyone else," the brunette spat bitterly, dabbing at my wound gently. I frowned. "No? I'm just messing with you, kid. How old are you anyway? You look too young to be a criminal." He snickered. He was a very sarcastic man, but at the same time he was helping me, so how bad could he be? 16. He chuckled at my answer. "And what has a 16-year-old done to land himself in the palace dungeons?" I remembered Skeppy's smirk as he pushed me off the building. "I'd rather not talk about it," I muttered truthfully. The revolutionary shrugged. "Your call. All done, by the way. You could sit up now," he added, giving me his first genuine smile. "Thanks." I nodded in appreciation, finding myself more able to move. Mud and blood still caked on my face, but at least there was no risk of infection. "You should wash your hands. They look pretty bad, too." I stared down at my palms. A mixture of dirt and red liquid coated them, and they still stung from the blisters the blade had inflicted. I pushed them into the bucket tentatively, rubbing them together to rid myself of the substances. When finished, I simply wiped my hands on my trousers, sighing. The brunette was sat on a bale of hay, elbows resting on his knees. He leaned his head forward, biting his thumbnail slightly between his laced-together fingers. "What did you say your name was?" he asked finally, pointing in my direction after much thought. I didn't." The revolutionary raised an eyebrow. "Care to enlighten me? We'll be spending a lot of time together, I reckon, given that we're cellmates." Tommy Innitson." I bowed my head slightly, running my thumb over the cheap material of my torn trousers. "Nice to meet you, Tommy. I'm Wilbur Soot." Chapter 6. There's an author's note here, so I'm gonna read that real quick. I hate to interrupt, but quick note that will make sense later in the chapter. Obviously, in the actual series, there's a whole thing about Fundy being Wilbur's son. However, in this, Wilbur is 23. And if he did have a son, he wouldn't be old enough to engage in the revolution. And I wanted to include Fundy, so I made him his younger brother. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, on with the story. Chapter 6. Honestly, the cell could have been worse. I could have been alone. At least with Wilbur here, I had someone to talk to, so that my mind didn't spiral out of control. The tall brunette was a queer character. He was overly sarcastic to the point where I couldn't determine whether he was being sincere or joking. He also had a weird habit of sitting completely still in utter silence for hours on end, thinking deeply. So most of the time, rather than holding a conversation, I talked at him, and he tolerated my presence. We'd been in here roughly 2 days. My head was feeling a lot better, but there was always the underlying stab of pain when I moved too quickly. If not for the beanie-wearing revolutionary, it would have been worse had he not cleaned it. "What were you doing when that mob attacked you?" I asked him, curious about the story behind the first time I ever saw him. "Tommy, you're going to have to be a lot more specific. I've been attacked by several mobs." The brunette droned monotonously, readjusting his black beanie. "A few weeks ago, when I saw you as I was entering L'Manberg for the first time," I answered, unsure as to whether he was being genuine with his previous statement. "Oh, right. It was my own fault. Usually is. I'd actually had a bit to drink down at the Halo. Very nice pub near PK Avenue. I got a bit antsy, okay? I tell a lie. I was absolutely drunk, and I started a bit of an argument with a charming man who called me some lovely names like traitorous twat. Wilbur chuckled slightly. I admired his ability to laugh at even the direst situations. Sounds like a nice guy, I added weakly. He was. Could have been a lot worse than one punch if Nicky hadn't intervened. He grimaced. Nicky? Blonde woman, singer, very short. Oh, of course, the singer. The conversation sort of ended after that, and we sat in silence. I wish I knew what was happening in Wilbur's brain. It was obvious he was intelligent, quick-witted, and smart. And above that, he was funny, confident, and fearless. Basically everything I wasn't. A question occurred to me, something I'd been intending to ask for a while. Hey, Will. I inclined my head in his direction. He looked up, ruffling his curly hair. What's up? This might sound really stupid, but... What, and the rest of the stuff you say isn't? He cut me off, chuckling dryly. Very funny. But as you know, I'm not from around here, and I was just wondering, what's your issue with the king? It's something I'd been dying to know. Sure, I knew the revolutionaries protested against him and his way of ruling, but I didn't quite understand the problem. Wilbur sighed, shoulders drooping. It's a long story, Tommy, he mumbled. Well, luckily I have a clear schedule, thanks to the fact we're in a cell, I pointed out. His sarcastic manner was rubbing off on me. The brunette laughed weakly at my response. All right then, kid, you asked for it. In a way, Wilbur calling me kid reminded me of Skeppy and the Blade calling me boy. But when they said it, it was an insult. Their voices were laced with a mocking tone. But when Will said it, it was softer, more delicate. I'd only known him for just over 48 hours, but the curly-haired man had quickly become like my older brother. Unlike the other two that had taken me in, he actually cared, checking on my injury every once in a while, and sometimes even slipped me some of his food, claiming I needed it more than him. I got the impression this wasn't the first time he'd ever been imprisoned, and he was trying to make the experience better for me. Dream is an awful ruler, he began. I was born into poverty in the capital. Growing up, I had it rough, really rough. My parents would have to beg on the streets for hours just to scavenge enough to buy a slice of bread for us to share. It was fine at first, when it was just me, but then when my brother Fundy was born, things started getting harder. We couldn't afford to live, and while we're barely surviving, the nobles, they're just living comfortably. Dream doesn't care about any of us. He sits on his throne in his beautiful palace, without the world even knowing what he looks like. Why should he be showered in riches and take our money through taxes, while he does fuck all? The rest of us have nothing. We don't even ask for much. All we want is only for Lemberg to become a free state, exempt from his rule. But no, that would mean sacrificing his pride, wouldn't it? Egotistical bastard. Wilbur was on his feet now, face ablaze with passion. I shrank against the wall, somewhat intimidated by the raw emotion in his voice. To my dismay, Wilbur's emotional yelling had attracted the attention of a guard. I watched in mild terror as the armor-clad man strode towards our cell, face murderous. Keep talking, you treasonous scum, and see where your words get you, he hissed slowly, pressing his face to the bars. I prayed Wilbur would back down and retreat quietly, but my prayers weren't answered. Instead, the brunette approached the man, glaring through the bars, answering in a dangerous voice, My words will get me freedom. They will get all of us freedom. The person you serve, your beloved king, is lazy and uncaring. He's a terrible ruler, and he will never truly care for his subjects. The revolutionary's words were cut off by the guard unlocking our cell and dragging Wilbur outside. At this point I stood up myself, yelling protest as he kicked the brunette to the floor, slamming his heel into his jaw. Blood dripped down Wilbur's chin, pooling on the floor. Stop it! I screamed out as Wilbur groaned in pain, the older male enduring more hits. The guards snarled as the brunette raised his head, spitting blood in the armored man's direction. Leave him alone! I yelled louder, trying to exit the cell and drag my new friend back inside. At this, another guard came and flung me backward to the floor. I hit the ground hard, letting out an involuntary whimper. Wait, don't hurt the kid. I had to blink a couple of times to truly register what Wilbur was saying. You can hit me all you want, but leave him out of this. He's done nothing wrong. Will, I tried to cut him off as more blood blossomed on his face. "Stay out of this, Tommy." I slid into the damp corner of the dungeon, pulling my knees to my chest. I pressed my eyes shut, not wanting to see the scene in front of me. I got a pretty bad vision of what was transpiring just by hearing Wilbur's cries of pain. Eventually the horrific sounds stopped, and I heard a large thud indicating Wilbur was back in the cell. Lesson learned. Don't talk about treasonous things near the King's Guard. I heard him chuckle gently. How could he joke at a time like this? I surprised myself by walking quickly across the room and throwing my arms around the older man in a hug. I realized what I'd done and backed away, face flushed with embarrassment. "Tommy, I'm okay. Don't worry about me." The brunette gave me a rare, genuine smile. I nodded quickly, head bowed. Once again our words were cut off by a guard, a different one this time. "Tommy Innitson?" I swallowed, looking up in fear. "Yes?" I responded quietly. "Lord George would like to see you." And with that, we stop. Next time we'll continue on with Chapter 7. You've all been a wonderful audience. If you liked it, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Bye!